The lights were off. Every single one. The entire third floor of the Apostolic Palace sat in total darkness. And standing alone in the middle of that ancient hallway, hands clasped behind his back, was the most powerful religious leader on earth, Pope Leo XIV. Breathing slowly, listening to the silence of rooms that hadn't heard footsteps in over 13 years, what he was about to do would split the Vatican in half. The date was June 29th, 2026, a Sunday, the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, one of the most sacred days on the Roman calendar. That morning, Pope Leo had just finished blessing the pallium for newly appointed metropolitan archbishops inside St. Peter's Basilica. The ceremony was flawless. Thousands packed the nave. Cameras broadcast every second to a global audience. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Something the cameras didn't catch. Something that would reshape the narrative of this entire papacy. 3 senior cardinals had requested an emergency private audience with the Pope. Not through normal channels, not through the official scheduler. They went directly to Monsignor Edgard Rimicuna Inga, the Pope's Peruvian private secretary, and demanded a meeting. The word they used was urgent, but what they actually meant was something closer to confrontation. Before we go further, if this story grips you, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps us bring you more content like this. Now, to understand what happened that night, we need to go back, not far, just a few months, to the moment when Leo XIV did something that no one inside the Vatican expected. Something that seemed simple on the surface, but was in reality a calculated act of war. On March 14th, 2026, the Holy See Press Office released a short statement, just 2 sentences. Matteo Brun, the director, confirmed it himself. Pope Leo XIV would take possession of the papal apartment inside the Apostolic Palace that very afternoon. He would move in with his closest collaborators. 2 sentences. That's all it took to send shockwaves through every corridor of power in Vatican City. But why? Why would a change of address cause such an earthquake? To understand that, you need to know what that apartment represents and what it meant that it had been empty for over a decade. When Pope Francis was elected in 2013, he made a decision that stunned the Catholic world. He refused to live in the Apostolic Palace. The apartment on the 3rd floor is the third loggia, they call it, the one popes had used since Pius X in 1903. Francis simply said no. He told his aides the space was too large, too isolating. He said the entrance was narrow, that only one person at a time could come in. He couldn't live without people around him. He said he heard an interior no when he saw the rooms, a spiritual instinct telling him to stay away. So he chose instead to stay at Casa Santa Marta, a guest house built in the 1990s for visiting clergy, room 2011. A modest suite with a wooden crucifix, basic furniture, and a small statue of Our Lady of Luján, the patroness of Argentina. For 12 years that became the papal residence, Francis ate in a communal dining room. He celebrated morning mass with staff. He lived among priests and bishops and visiting officials. It was by every measure unprecedented, and it was deeply symbolic. A pope rejecting the grandeur of the palace, choosing simplicity, choosing the margins over the center. The world loved it. The media praised it endlessly. It became one of the defining images of Francis's pontificate. The humble pope, the servant leader, the man who slept in a hotel room while a palace sat empty. When Francis died on April 21st, 2025, Easter Monday, that apartment in the palace was sealed. Standard protocol. Cardinal Kevin Farrell the Camello placed the seals on the door himself. The rooms hadn't been occupied since Benedict XVI walked out on February 28th, 2013. Over 13 years of silence, of dust, of darkness, no one expected what came next. Just 3 days after his election on May 11th, 2025, Pope Leo walked to the Apostolic Palace and personally removed those seals. Cameras captured the moment, his hand on the ancient door, the seal breaking under his fingers, the heavy wooden door swinging open for the first time in over a decade. He stepped inside and walked through every room, the study, the library, the chapel, the vestibule, the dining room. He ran his hand along the walls. He opened the windows. He stood at the famous Angelus window and looked down at St. Peter's Square. He said nothing publicly that day, not a word. But those who were with him later said his face told a story. Not nostalgia, not admiration, not sentimentality. Calculation, cold, strategic, methodical calculation. He was already planning something, and he was 3 steps ahead of everyone. But what no one knew, what wouldn't become clear for nearly a year, was what he saw in those rooms that day. Not just the faded frescoes, not just the dusty chandeliers, not just the outdated plumbing and corroded pipes. He saw doors, closed doors, doors that led to adjacent rooms in the 3rd loggia, rooms that weren't technically part of the papal apartment, but sat right next to it. Rooms that should have been empty, but weren't. He noticed that some of these doors had locks that looked newer than everything else, fresh hardware on ancient frames. He noticed filing cabinets visible through gaps in warped wood. He noticed the faint smell of paper and ink, the unmistakable scent of stored documents. He didn't say anything, not then. He simply noted it, filed it away, and began to plan. Over the next 10 months, the Vatican undertook a massive renovation of the apartment. Electricians rewired entire sections. Plumbers replaced pipes that hadn't been touched since John Paul II's era. Structural engineers reinforced walls. The heating system was completely replaced. Workers came and went for months. A crane appeared near the building, visible from the square. Italian journalists began speculating wildly. Paparazzi tried to photograph the work from neighboring rooftops. Vatican security increased patrols, but the Vatican said nothing official, only that routine maintenance was being performed. Meanwhile, Leo stayed at the Palazzo del Sant'Osio, the Palace of the Holy Office, a small residence inside Vatican City, where he'd already lived while serving as prefect of the dicastery for bishops under Francis. It was functional, quiet, and adequate. His rooms were modest. He kept his Augustinian habits, simple meals, early rising, long hours of reading, but he was restless. Those who saw him during those months said he seemed impatient, not with the renovation timeline, with something else entirely. And then in March 2026, he made his move, literally. The reaction was immediate, and it was brutally divided. Traditionalists celebrated. Finally, the papal apartment was restored. The Pope back where he belonged. Order reestablished. They pointed to history, past the 10th, past 12th, Paul VI, John Paul Ist, John Paul II, Benedict XVI. All of them had lived in that apartment. It was the natural home of the Bishop of Rome. Leo was simply returning to the norm. But progressives saw it differently. Many of them loyal to Francis's legacy, they viewed it as a betrayal, a symbolic slap in the face. Francis had made Casa Santa Marta a statement, a theological argument made of bricks and mortar. The Pope is a servant, not a king. The Pope lives among his people, not above them. And now Leo was undoing that, walking back into the palace, sitting behind the same gilded desk, looking out the same imperial window. Opinion columns exploded. Social media was on fire. Hashtags trended in 6 languages. Catholic bloggers published furious takes. Progressive theologians wrote open letters. Conservative commentators celebrated with equal intensity. The Vatican was once again at war with itself. But Leo said nothing. He offered no public explanation, no interview, no written statement, no tweet, no press conference, just silence. Absolute, deliberate, maddening silence. For weeks, the tension simmered. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had the answer to the only question that mattered. Why? And that's where we return to the night of June 29th, the night that changed everything. The 3 cardinals who demanded the audience were not minor figures. These were heavyweights. 2 of them had served directly under Pope Francis in key curial positions. One had been part of Francis's informal inner circle, the so-called C9 Council of Cardinal Advisors. The third was a respected African cardinal known for his independence and moral authority. Together, they represented the most powerful bloc of Francis loyalists still active in the Vatican. They arrived at the papal apartment around 8:30 in the evening. The Pallium ceremony had ended hours earlier. The crowds had dispersed. St. Peter's Square was nearly empty. Only a handful of tourists wandered in the summer twilight. The Roman heat pressed against the old stone walls like a living thing. Monsignor Remicuna led them through the corridor of the third lodge, past the frescoed ceilings painted by masters whose names history had half forgotten, past the Swiss guards standing motionless in their Renaissance uniforms, past the heavy wooden doors that separated the papal apartment from the rest of the palace into the private study. Leo was already there, seated, not behind the desk. That was a deliberate choice. He sat in an armchair near the window, the famous Angelus window. The curtains were open. Rome glowed beneath him, the dome of the Pantheon, the lights along the Tiber, the silhouette of Castel Sant'Angelo, a city layered with centuries of power and prayer. He didn't stand when they entered. He gestured for them to sit, and then he waited. He let the silence work for him. Let it fill the room. Let it press against them. The eldest cardinal spoke first. His voice was measured, diplomatic, but tight beneath the surface. He said the move into the palace had created confusion among the faithful, that bishops around the world were asking questions, that the signal being sent was one of, he paused, choosing his word carefully, regression. Leo's expression didn't change. His hands remained folded in his lap. The second cardinal added his concern. He said that Francis's choice of Santa Marta had been more than personal preference. It was doctrinal in spirit. He argued a living homily, a pope who sleeps among his brothers and preaches something powerful without ever opening his mouth. Thy pope, who retreats to a palace, no matter his intentions, preaches something else entirely. The third cardinal was the most direct. He said the optics were devastating. that Leo was giving ammunition to every critic who accused him of reversing Francis's reforms, that the media narrative was hardening fast. American Pope, Palace Pope. Traditionalist in reformist clothing, he said the longer Leo stayed silent about his reasons, the worse the damage would become. He said the church couldn't afford another credibility crisis. Not now, not after everything. There was a pause, long enough for all three men to shift uncomfortably in their chairs, long enough for the ticking of an old clock on the mantel to become the loudest sound in the room. And then Leo spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, the voice of a man who had spent decades listening to confessions and counseling struggling parishes in rural Peru. But every word landed like stone dropped from height. "You came here tonight," he said, "to tell me that where I sleep defines what kind of pope I am?" None of them answered. He let the silence return. 3 seconds. 5, 7. "Let me tell you why I am here." What followed was not a defense. It was not an apology. It was not a negotiation. It was a dismantling, piece by piece, brick by brick. Leo told them he had studied the layout of Casa Santa Marta for months before making his decision. Not casually, systematically. He had reviewed the building's operational reports, the staffing, logs, the room allocation records going back a decade, the maintenance budgets, the visitor intake numbers, and what he found disturbed him deeply. When Francis moved into Santa Marta, the entire second floor had to be converted for papal use. Security was expanded, access was restricted, rooms were sealed. The building's normal capacity for visiting clergy and guests was reduced by roughly a third. Rooms that would have housed bishops and priests from around the world, rooms designed specifically for pastoral hospitality, were closed off, permanently for 12 years. "Do you know how many visiting bishops were turned away from Santa Marta during those years because there was no room?" Leo asked. "Because the Pope was sleeping where guests were supposed to stay. None of them had the number." "I do," Leo said. "I counted." He let that sink in. "Santa Marta was built to serve the church," he said. "When it became a papal residence, it stopped serving the church. The humility was real. I don't question Francis's heart, but the consequence was real too. But he wasn't finished. He was barely getting started. He told them something else, something that would later leak to the Italian press and dominate global headlines for days, something that reframed the entire narrative of his papacy. During the renovation of the Apostolic Palace apartment, workers had gained access to adjacent rooms in the third loggia, rooms that had been quietly sealed off, not by official protocol after Francis's death, but years earlier. Rooms that nobody had formally inventoried. Rooms that contained filing cabinets, boxes, shelved binders, internal correspondence, financial, spreadsheets, personnel files, documents spanning at least 15 years. Leo paused here. He looked each cardinal in the eye, one by one, slowly. "I moved into this palace," he said, "because what was hidden in these rooms needed a pope living next to it." The room went cold, he explained carefully. Precisely. During the 12 years the apartment stood empty, certain Vatican departments had used adjacent rooms in the third loggia for unofficial storage, not archival storage that had proper facilities elsewhere. This was different. These were documents that should have been archived properly but weren't. Financial records from the Secretariat of State that had been flagged but never filed. Internal memos related to investigations that were quietly shelved. Correspondence involving individuals who were later implicated in scandals, but whose paper trails had been conveniently misplaced. Materials that had accumulated over time pushed to the margins, placed behind doors that no one opened because no one lived there to open them because the Pope was across the gardens in a guest house. "When a palace is empty," Leo said, "it becomes a warehouse for things people want to forget." The cardinal sat in stunned silence. Leo leaned forward in his chair, his eyes sharp, focused, the eyes of a canon lawyer. The eyes of a man who had spent his doctoral work studying authority structures and religious orders. "I didn't move here to be a king," he said. "I moved here to be a witness. You cannot clean a house you don't live in." He told them he had already instructed a small team, handpicked of trusted archivists and canon lawyers, to begin cataloging every document found in those sealed rooms. The work had been underway since late March, quietly, methodically, under his direct personal supervision. No one outside his immediate household knew, not the Secretary of State, not the Council of Cardinals, not the press office, until this very moment. The eldest cardinal's face had gone pale. He asked the obvious question, what had they found so far? Leo's answer was measured but devastating. He said the documents covered a wide range. Some were administrative, routine, harmless, decades of mundane correspondence that simply hadn't been properly filed, but others were not. Some related to financial transactions through the Vatican Bank during the early 2010s, transfers that had been flagged by European regulators but never fully investigated internally. The amounts were significant. The names attached were recognizable. Several involved people are still active in Vatican service. Other documents involve personnel decisions, bishops appointed or removed, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Diocesan complaints that had been received, logged, and then buried. There were letters, private letters between high-ranking officials discussing the suppression of internal reports. Not one or two, dozens. The Church has many wounds, Leo said. Some were inflicted from outside, but too many were self-inflicted, and the evidence of those wounds was sitting in sealed rooms 3 doors from where I now sleep. He stood up, slowly, walked to the window, looked out over St. Peter's Square. The fountains were still running. The obelisk cast a long shadow under the streetlights. Francis was a great man, he said. His voice was lower now, almost tender. His humility was real. His love for the poor was genuine. His spirit was beautiful. But when he left this palace empty, he left a vacuum, and vacuums attract him. Shadows. He turned back to face them. I am here now. The shadows are gone. The lights are on. And they will stay on. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Leo outlined what would happen next. The timeline, the commission structure, the scope, but the core of it was done. The question had been answered. The silence had been broken. The 3 cardinals left the apartment just after 10. They descended through the palace corridors without speaking. Their footsteps echoed off marble floors. The Swiss guards watched them pass with trained impassivity. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them one by one. None of them spoke until they reached the courtyard. By the next morning, June 30th, fragments of the conversation had already leaked. Someone talked. An Italian journalist published a report at 7 a.m. citing unnamed Vatican sources. The headline was explosive. Pope Leo claims hidden documents found inside Apostolic Palace. Within hours, every major news outlet in the world picked it up. Reuters, Associated Press, BBC, CNN, The Guardian, Leon, Al Jazeera. The story moved at a velocity the Vatican had not experienced since the financial scandals of the previous decade. The Holy See press office issued a statement at noon. It was carefully worded. Brun confirmed that archival materials had been found during the renovation process. He stated that the materials were being reviewed by appropriate Vatican authorities. He emphasized that the review is standard procedure during any major restoration. He asked for patience and discretion, but no one was buying the routine framing because Leo's own words leaked or paraphrased told a completely different story. This wasn't routine. This was surgical. He had moved into the palace precisely because of what those rooms contained. He had engineered his own proximity to the evidence. He had played the long game for 10 months, said nothing, endured the criticism, absorbed the attacks, all to position himself exactly where he needed to be. The man from Chicago, the missionary from Peru, the quiet Austinian who had spent 20 years in seminaries and parish rectories and dusty diocesan offices. He had outmaneuvered the entire Vatican bureaucracy, and they never saw it coming. On July 1st, the pressure intensified dramatically. A group of 8 cardinals, 4 European, 2 African, 1 Asian, 1 South American, released a joint statement calling for complete transparency. They didn't criticize Leo directly. They praised his commitment to accountability. But they asked publicly for a full disclosure of what had been found. They invoked the language of the Synod on synodality. They spoke of trust, of co-responsibility, of walking together in the light. It was by Vatican standards extraordinary. 8 princes of the Church publicly pressured the Pope for answers. Not in private, not through intermediaries, in front of the entire world. Leo responded the same day, not with a written statement, not through Bruni. He responded in person during his weekly general audience in St. Peter's Square, attended by over 15,000 pilgrims baking under the July sun. He departed from his prepared catechesis on the Beatitudes. He spoke for nearly 12 minutes without notes. His voice carried across the square through the speakers, clear, steady, unflinching. He acknowledged the reports. He acknowledged the documents. He said the Church had nothing to fear from its own history, only from its refusal to face it. He said transparency was not a threat to the institution. It was the institution's only path forward. He said he had learned in Peru, among the poorest communities in the Andes, that people don't lose faith because of sin. They lose faith because of silence, because the powerful refuge to speak, because the truth gets locked in rooms that no one opens. And then he said something that would be quoted in every newspaper on earth by nightfall. This palace is not my throne. This is my post. A sentinel does not sleep in the garden. He sleeps on the wall. The crowd erupted. Applause broke out across the square. Pilgrims stood. Several bishops in the front rows were visibly moved. A group of young seminarians from the Philippines began chanting his name. The sound echoed off the colonnade. Leo stood still, absorbing it, not performing, just standing there. A 70-year-old man in white carrying the weight of 1.5 billion souls. But the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. That night, July 1st, Leo summoned his 2 private secretaries to his study, Monsignor Rimuna and Father Marco Belleri, the young Italian priest who had joined his household after the election. He closed the door. He sat behind his desk for the first time that day, and he gave them a directive. By the end of July, a preliminary report on the discovered documents would be presented to a specially convened commission. The commission would include canon lawyers from 3 different continents, independent financial auditors with no Vatican ties, and crucially, 3 lay experts from outside the church entirely. Secular professionals with backgrounds in forensic accounting and investigative journalism. Leo insisted on the lay members. He was adamant. If we investigate ourselves, he said, we will find only what we want to find. The church does not need another internal review that reassures us everything is fine. The church needs eyes that have never worked inside these walls. Raikkonen asked if the commission's findings would be made public. Leo's answer was immediate. No hesitation, no qualification. Every word Belleri asked for a follow-up. What if the findings implicated people still in positions of authority? Leo's eyes didn't waver. Then they will no longer be in positions of authority. That was the moment more than any other that defined what the palace move truly meant. It wasn't about architecture. It wasn't about tradition versus modernity. It wasn't about rejecting Francis or embracing Benedict. It wasn't about luxury or humility. It was about something far more fundamental. Access. Not power for its own sake, but physical proximity to information. The ability to walk down a corridor at 2 in the morning and open a door that everyone else had forgotten existed. The ability to stand in a room full of buried correspondence and say, this ends now. This is over. The light is coming in, and it's not going away. Francis had governed from a guest house. His humility was genuine. His intentions were pure, but his distance from the palace had consequences no one anticipated. It created space, physical, literal, architectural space, for bureaucratic neglect, for convenient amnesia, for files to accumulate behind locked doors with no one to account for them, for decades of institutional inertia to congeal into something much darker. Leo understood this, not theoretically, practically. He understood it. From his years as prefect of the Dicaster for Bishops, he had seen how the Vatican machinery functioned. He knew where the gears stuck, where the oil dried up, where the rust settled, where the mechanisms of accountability quietly broke down because no one was watching. And he knew that some problems couldn't be solved from a guest house across the gardens. Some problems required you to sleep in the room next door, to hear the silence, to feel the weight of what was hidden. On the morning of July the 2nd, Leo celebrated Mass in his private chapel inside the Apostolic Palace, a small, intimate space with centuries-old frescoes and a plain wooden altar. Just Leo, his 2 secretaries, and 2 elderly Augustinian brothers who had served with him in Chiclio, Peru, decades earlier, men who had walked through muddy villages with him, who had eaten rice and beans at parish tables, who had prayed with families who had nothing. They were the connective tissue between who Leo was and who Leo had become. The readings that morning spoke of truth and courage, of standing firm when the ground shifts, of being salt and light in a world that preferred darkness. After Mass, Leo sat alone in his study for nearly an hour. He wrote a personal letter handwritten in Spanish, his mother's language, the language of his years in Peru, the language of his prayers. The letter was addressed to the Archbishop of Lima, a man Leo had known since his earliest missionary days. The contents were never made public, but those close to Leo said he was preparing himself for what was coming. The Lampedusa visit on July 4th, a trip to the island that served as a gateway for thousands of migrants from Africa and the Middle East. The Liberty Medal. Video message to Philadelphia for July 3rd. The growing storm around the palace documents, the weight of it all. He reportedly told Father Belleri that afternoon, sitting in the fading light of the study, his voice barely above a whisper. When I was a young Augustinian in Chicago, I thought the hardest part of faith was believing in God. Now I know the hardest part is believing in the church and doing it anyway. By midday on July the 2nd, the Italian press was running a new angle, explosive. Several outlets reported that among the documents found in the palace, there were letters related to financial transfers made through the Vatican Bank, the I.O., during the early 2010s, transfers that had been flagged by European banking regulators, transfers that had been reported to Vatican internal compliance, and then nothing. No follow-up, no investigation, no action. The compliance reports simply ended mid-sentence in some cases, as if someone had reached in and pulled the thread. The amounts mentioned in the press reports were staggering. The names attached were not published, but sources described them as familiar to anyone who followed Vatican affairs in the last 15 years. The implications were devastating. The Vatican's response was swift this time, faster than anyone expected. The prefect of the Secretariat for the Economy issued a statement within 3 hours. He confirmed that financial records from the referenced period existed and were being reviewed as part of the broader archival process. He emphasized that any irregularities discovered would be referred to the appropriate judicial authorities both within Vatican City State and internationally if necessary. He noted that Pope Leo had personally instructed full cooperation with external regulators. That last line was the one that mattered. Full cooperation with external regulators. In Vatican history, those words had almost never been spoken. The Holy See had long guarded its financial sovereignty with the intensity of a sovereign nation. Its independence from external judicial oversight was considered sacrosanct. Inviting outside scrutiny wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. It was the sound of a wall coming down, and it traced directly back to one man's decision to sleep in a different building. Because it was Leo, walking those corridors alone at night, opening those doors with his own hands, standing in those dusty rooms, reading faded memos by lamplight, who had first discovered the scope of what was hidden. Not a commission, not an audit team, not a whistleblower, not a journalist. The Pope himself, personally, physically, present in the room, present in the palace, present where the truth was buried. That evening, July the 2nd, as the sun dropped behind the dome of St. Peter's and painted the Roman sky in shades of amber and crimson, Leo stood once again at the window of his study, the window the world knew from every Sunday broadcast. Below him, pilgrims moved. Through the square in the cooling air, tourists snapped photos of the basilica. A group of Franciscan sisters walked slowly toward the fountain. Street vendors packed up their stalls. The ordinary rhythm of Rome, beautiful, ancient, indifferent to scandal. But inside the palace, nothing was ordinary anymore. Leo turned from the window. Monsignor Rimicuna was waiting in the doorway, patient, quiet, the way he always was. "Are the files ready?" Leo asked. "All of them, Holy Father." "Then we begin." He walked past his secretary, down the corridor, past the chapel, past the library, past the dining room where a single place setting waited untouched, toward a room at the far end of the third soldier. A room with a heavy door and a new lock, a room that for over a decade had been forgotten by everyone except the people who needed it. Forgotten. He opened the door, stepped inside, and began to read. The lights of the Apostolic Palace stayed on that night. Every single one visible from the square below, visible from across the Tiber, visible from the Pincian Hill, a beacon in the Roman darkness. People who passed by on their evening walks looked up and noticed. Some pointed, some took photos, some simply stared. A palace that had been dark for 13 years was suddenly, unmistakably, alive, and the man inside it was not sleeping. He was working, he was reading, he was cleaning the house, not with a broom, with the truth. In the weeks that followed, the story would grow. More documents, more revelations, more questions demanding answers. The commission Leo ordered would be formally constituted by mid-July. Its members announced it publicly. Its mandate is published on the Vatican website for the world to read. The first preliminary report would come before the end of summer. In the Catholic Church, all 1.4 billion faithful spread across every continent would face a reckoning unlike anything in modern memory. Not imposed from outside, not forced by scandal breaking in the press, but initiated from within. By a pope who understood that the most radical act of reform wasn't changing doctrine. It wasn't rewriting canon law. It wasn't even living in a guest house to prove your humility. It was moving into the room where the secrets were kept and turning on the lights. Robert Francis Prevost, son of Chicago, missionary of Peru, Augustinian friar, canon lawyer, man of mathematics and faith. Pope Leo XIV, the man who moved into the palace not for its grandeur but for its ghosts. Because ghosts only survive in the dark, and Leo brought the light. If this story moved you, do us a favor. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Every single click helps us continue telling the stories the world needs to know. We'll see you in the next